Ladies and gentlemen of the press, welcome at the Prosecuting Authority. We welcome the former President of South Africa, Mr. de Klerk, and his wife, Mrs. de Klerk.
No, this one. Not me.
Anyway. We are honored to have you in our midst. I have a short introduction. This has nothing to do with us. My name is René van Zanten, and when I was editor-in-chief of Utrecht Nieuwsblad, we participated in the yearly Europe lecture. We had great speakers like Lord Carrington, Javier Solana, Judge Goldstone, and they gave their view on Europe. And we looked at it from different angles. Is there such a thing as European art? What's the importance of the European Football League? Introduction of the Euro, etc. Almost 10 years later, there are many reasons to try to revitalize this lecture. And we thought it seemed like a good idea to ask speakers to look at Europe from the outside, from a different angle, a different perspective. Is the European Union something to take seriously, something to envy, something to criticize, to fear maybe? And I talked about this with the Montesquieu Institute, and now I'm pointing in the right direction, Lisbeth, which aims at spreading and explaining knowledge about Europe. So there was a perfect match. They were enthusiastic, and that's really where my role stopped, because they organize everything that's happening today. I'm just happy that the city of The Hague, with its reputation in the field of peace and justice, was willing to host this event, and I'm grateful that the Montesquieu Institute succeeded in continuing a great tradition and even add something to this tradition. Because not only is it exciting to experience a lecture on Europe from a completely different perspective, we are of course very pleased that Mr. de Klerk is willing to give us his views on Europe. It's the first time that this lecture is given by a former statesman who actually was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It's important to point out that this lecture is the only reason why Mr. de Klerk is here today. Yesterday he was in Warsaw, tomorrow he will be somewhere else. Mr. de Klerk is not here to have meetings with politicians. He is not here on behalf of an organization. He is here simply because we asked him, with his experience as a statesman, and because he's still very active as an advocate for peace and democracy, to express his views on Europe. So, there seemed to be no need to organize a press conference, and there was very little time to give interviews. Nevertheless, you people informed if there was an opportunity to ask some questions, and that's why we organize this questions and answers session. We have about 30 minutes. Sorry I took some minutes out of that. And we will do this Q&A in English. But if you want to ask your question in Dutch, that's okay. Mr. de Klerk will understand, or I will translate.
Zolang je langzaam praat.
Okay. I would like to ask the photographers to take pictures for about 5 minutes, but not do this all the time because it distracts us from the Q&A. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please.
Casper Roelvink from Europa Nu, the European Union news site. You've been involved in organizing and supporting democratic processes for years and years now. And to what extent can the EU or similar governmental organizations help in creating stable democracies in other countries? For instance, in the Arab Spring there was lots of debate on whether it was successful or not. So my question is, can such organizations help in building democracy? And if so, what was lacking in EU policy and what was successful in EU policy when trying to do so?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction also. Yes, I think especially organizations can be very helpful in promoting democracy in undemocratic countries or in countries which are on their way to democracy. I think countries and countries together collectively, like in a body like the European Union, has less of a capacity to specifically influence the political decision making, in the sense that in the developing world it will easily be regarded as prescriptiveness especially from former colonial powers, there is a psychological resistance against prescription from the developed world. I also think there's a perception that quite often when countries in the developing world are encouraged to become more democratic, that there's a perception that the USA wants to export its model of democracy, and I think there's room and space to allow countries to develop their own brand of democracy which fits in with their culture, which fits in maybe even with their religion. I myself started in 2004 an organization called the Global Leadership Foundation, where I brought together 35 former presidents, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, senior diplomats. And our niche is, we advise leaders in the developing world on a discreet and confidential basis. Why discreet and confidential? Because we believe there's a loss of face. If you come with 2 TV teams or with a formal delegation and you make announcements, you need help, you need advice, we are here to advise you. So it's for that reason that we say confidential and discreet, but we're not a secret organization. The names of our members are well known. Mr. Hans van der Broek was a founding member with me. He recently asked, because of his age, to step down, but he has rendered invaluable service. So yes, I think there is room and space and a need for advice and encouragement on constitutional issues, but the best way countries can advise, can advance democracy in the developing world is by being involved through investment, by doing business with those countries, by expanding ties with those countries. And I'm very concerned about, from an African point of view, what I perceive at times a lack of strategy on the side of Europe vis-à-vis Africa. I quote in the speech, which I will deliver later, the fact that Thabo Mbeki was shocked when he found that we weren't on the agenda of a certain meeting. Somehow or another, China has a coherent strategy for Africa. I don't think the European Union and the individual members of the European Union have a coherent strategy for Africa. I sometimes get the feeling it is as if there is still a feeling in Europe that Africa is a problem, whereas Africa is emerging as an economic giant. If you look at growth rates in Africa, Africa is amongst the countries doing best in the world, many African countries. At the moment there are many opportunities. So I will be making a plea for Africa to be shifted upwards on the agenda of Europe, and I will be making a plea for Europe to take a much more direct and active interest in what is happening on the continent of Africa.
And by that you mean not just development aid, but a broader business investment, a total agenda?
Business investment is much better than development aid. Yes, there's a need for development aid vis-à-vis issues like malaria, like HIV/AIDS, like hunger. Yes, that shouldn't stop. But in the end, investment, doing business, helping to create jobs there is the best way to ensure upward mobility for the youth of today in the developing world.
Mr. President, I would like to ask a very specific South African question. Let me just give the background for the other people if they don't know. Advocate Vusi Piccoli used to be a public prosecutor, the head of the public prosecutor office in South Africa. He has wrote out his memoirs. He was sacked by the ANC government a few years ago. And he has brought out the fact that the ANC has time and again intervened in the prosecution of important people, such as Jacob Zuma, who was at the time not yet president, for corruption, and Jackie Selebi, who was the chief of the police, and so on. I would like to know your comments on that.
I haven't read the autobiography. I've taken note from my iPad, and you refreshed my memory about what Advocate Piccoli is saying. It reflects a much wider concern. What he is saying confirms what many other organizations and individuals have been airing in South Africa. In terms of our constitution, an independent prosecuting authority is as important as independent courts are. Our courts are still independent, but a whole series of events, you have mentioned some of them in your questions, indicate that there is political and has been political interference in the prosecuting authority. There was great concern that for quite a long time, President Zuma did not appoint a successor and to a previous prosecutor who was found by a commission appointed by the ANC not to be fit and proper, a fit and proper person to hold the post. I've forgotten the name. Similane.
Yeah.
So the prosecuting authority has been in the spotlight for interference in its operations, for not operating properly, and for the fact that there's a grave risk of it being manipulated for party political purposes or to protect certain individuals against prosecution. You mentioned Jackie Selebi. In the end, he was prosecuted. He was found guilty and he received a jail sentence. There was the recent case of Ndluli, where a senior prosecutor who wanted to go ahead with the prosecution was relieved of her post, ostensibly for other reasons. But she took it to court, and it's still sub judice to the best of my knowledge, so I don't want to go into detail. Another example of, I believe, possible manipulation of the prosecuting authority. My foundation in South Africa and I myself, we are on record about our deep concerns about the state of affairs at the prosecuting authority, and so are many other organizations interested in upholding the Constitution.
Thank you.
You're in the house of the Montesquieu Institute, where the trias politica is a leading principle. So,
I would like to ask, in connection to the Syria crisis, we saw that the EU was unable to make a common strategy and therefore lost influence. Do you think that the world still sees you as an important player in conflicts like this?
Just repeat the last part.
Do you think the world still sees the EU as an important player?
I think the world looks at the EU and realizes that it's not a federation, therefore it's not to the full extent a political entity, and that on some, with regard to many matters, it is more a question of what individual states decide to do, and on other issues it's a question that the European Union do take decisions. I think the more political the issue becomes, the less cohesive the European Union are. And in that sense of the word, I think with the present constitutional phase in which the European Union finds itself, it won't have much opportunity as a union to influence events in other countries, and that individual countries, and especially the leading strong countries, will follow their own foreign policies, and at times the foreign policy of some members might differ from the foreign policy of other members. So I will be making a plea in my speech for the European Union to decide, does it want to integrate further or does it want to develop another model? I have certain opinions privately on that, but somehow or another, where it is in the middle, it's at times neither here nor there.
So you think it's necessary that something
I'm not
changes?
necessarily a federalist. I think there are dangers involved in Europe federalizing to the full extent. I think already there's been too much centralization of power about things which actually should not be centralized. Let me in lighter vein say, I was at a conference a few years ago in Germany somewhere, and the German speaker said he counted the number of words in the 10 Commandments, and it was, I can't remember, let's say 500. And he counted the words in the American Constitution, and let's say it was 1,200. And then he counted the words of regulations about importing bananas to the European Union, and it was 30,000. Personally, I feel federalization can only work if there is maximum devolution of functions to the individual member states, and that centralization of power should be limited to a limited number of issues in the field of security, in the field of economic and financial policy making, and things like that, and that it should be more like a federation, more like America, even maybe more like India, than an intimate federation where there's a lot of power at the center and where there's no competition between the states. It's as if the European Union has taken a road to not to have competition between its member states. They must just work together but not compete economically and so forth. And I think that's wrong. In America, the states compete strongly against each other. California, on its own, has a very strong economy. And there's a constant tension between the powers of the state and the powers of the federal government. Europe needs to decide where it wants to go, and it needs to move fast.
My question is a bit of a follow-up, actually. You've talked about the economic and political policies of the Federation, but we see in America that people have a sense of that they are Americans. And we saw with the World Cup in South Africa that people feel South African when they cheer for their country. There's not such a thing as a European feeling, because you've been president of a country where there is such a feeling as being South African. Do you think that there ever will be that we ever can create some sort of European culture, European feeling, so to say, in your personal opinion?
I think yes, to a certain extent, but only if you don't feel that different national nations forming part of the European Union feel that their identity will be threatened by a European identity. So the answer lies in striking a balance between recognizing the different national identities within each member state. After all, they all have their own cultures, they have their own languages, and they're fundamentally different in many respects from each other. And only if they feel that they are building blocks of a greater whole, but that they are not being assimilated by that greater whole. Will they develop this second identity? All of us have different identities. I'm an Afrikaner. I'm a South African. I'm an African. And by heritage, to a certain extent, I'm also a European, but I regard myself as an African, no longer as a European. President Mandela is a Xhosa, and he's very proud of it. And he's a South African, and he's an African. And the world is becoming more and more diverse. And only if you accommodate the diversity, and only if you recognize minorities. Now, I'll translate that now with regard to your question, but within a country, only if you accommodate minorities in a meaningful way so that they feel their concerns are being listened to. They are not marginalized. They are regarded as a building block to the greater whole which make a contribution. Only then will diversity not create tension, which even at times then develops into conflict. Now, in the case of Europe, the smaller states will show more resistance to a European identity because they feel they might just be gobbled up and almost lose their identity, and there will always be resistance to that. The difference between America, for instance, and Europe is the Americans together fought against the colonial power. It merged them as a nation in their history.
And we have never had a war.
You had many wars against each other,
Yeah,
but you had never had a war against an outside power outside of Europe. That gives you some food for
thought. Is that
thought.
the only solution then that we have? Sorry, that
It's okay.
that we create some sort of by war, by a negative.
No, I'm against war. I think the European Union has achieved one wonderful thing, and that is to avoid the risk of war and tension. And in my speech, I will also make it clear we want the European Union to succeed in whatever form. But Europe must get its own house in order in the process. And by pushing European identity too hard, there will be a backlash. That doesn't mean European identity shouldn't be developed and shouldn't grow, but not at the cost of national identity.
You mentioned China.
I forgot it. Could you please tell your name before you?
I'm Nicola, because I'm journalist for Trouw. It's a
Trouw,
national
okay.
day. You mentioned China having a coherent strategy when it comes to Africa, and the EU is lacking that. But how do you prevent, I mean, is Africa waiting for Europeans coming in and telling exactly, well, we know better, so you just do whatever we tell you?
But
it
China-
seems like China is having it that a bit less.
No, China is not coming and telling Africa,
No, but aren't you waiting?
you must do better. They come and they do business.
Okay.
They come and they say, they secure their interests. They enter into long-term contracts. In the process, they address some of the social and socio-economic problems in Africa. They come and they say, we want a contract for your oil. And part of the package which they negotiate is, we will build you a dam, we will build you a railway. There is resistance in Africa against one aspect of China's approach, and that is that China then brings in Chinese labor to build the railways and to build the dam. And Africa feels, no, they must come and invest and build the dam, but they must create jobs for Africans in the process. So China is only the 6th biggest investor in Africa at the moment. European countries and South Africa are above China. The USA, 3 European countries, and South Africa are biggest investors in Africa than China is at the moment, but China's graph is going up. And the graph with regard to I think the European Union members is remaining sort of at level peg, and they're not grasping the new opportunities which are opening up in many parts of Africa. Yes.
So would you say...
Could you please?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Dichna Latenbeek. I'm a student from a student organization. So would you say that what South Africa and Africa as a whole needs more is bilateral relations with countries like China, or would it be more foundational support from the World Bank?
It needs everything. I would like to arrange it in a sort of a pecking order. In the case of the European Union, for instance, Africa needs the European Union to relax some of its protective measures so that African products can more easily be sold in Europe. There are all sorts of walls which are putting African countries at a disadvantage. The subsidization, for instance, of your agriculture is making it very difficult for exporters of fresh fruit, just to give one example, to export to Europe. Yes, we do outside of your season, and we have some success, and Europe is a very important market for our fruit and our wine and things like that. But somehow or another, the negotiation of free trade agreements and so on, they are lagging and they're not progressing as they should have progressed. I've mentioned in my speech, I don't have the figure in my head now, the limited number of trade agreements which have been negotiated between the European Union and South Africa and other African countries, and much more progress should have been made already in that regard.
And would you say that goes for migration too? Sorry.
Migration is going to become a bigger and bigger problem for Africa. With the population growth rate in the most developed countries in Europe, you will be forced, if you want to sustain your economies, to import more and more labor. You are simply just not producing enough people to fill the existing jobs, even if you don't have big economic growth. So I see a trend that more and more Europe will have to rely on immigration, and maybe rather than just closing its borders and having the crisis that we see with boats coming from Africa, should have a more imaginative immigration policy.
Where can you?
Yes, my name is
I'll come back to it.
Jurgen Stubb. I'm running for the Dutch press agency in Melbourne. I have a question which is perhaps a little bit off topic. It's about the Netherlands, but it has to do with national identity. Are you familiar with Sinterklaas and Zwarte Piet?
Not really.
Not really.
It rings a bell somewhere.
It rings a bell.
You'll have to inform me, but
It didn't make the headlines in the Herald Tribune yet, I think. No.
It's something we celebrate each year. It's a sort of Santa Claus. Santa Claus.
I mean, Santa Claus, I know who he is, but
Black Pete, Zwarte Piet. That's its 8, and he's black. And there's a huge discussion here in the Netherlands. With many critics, he say Black Pete, this tradition should be abolished because it's racism. And I wondered, with your background, if you think too that this is racist and which tradition should be abolished.
racism is wrong. And racism is not something which only existed in the apartheid years in South Africa. It exists across the world. We've just had UEFA is now investigating racist chanting in Moscow against a black soccer player. So I condemn racism. We negotiated in South Africa when we ended apartheid a new constitution which is aimed at the goal and the ideal of becoming a truly non-racial state. We're not at all times doing so well at the moment in that regard, but that is what our constitution says is where we want to be. At times, I think, I don't know enough about Sinterklaas and Zwart Piet to make a specific comment on that. But at times, I think people who fight against racism, and I support all such people, have a tendency to go a bit overboard and to read negativity into some things which are not negatively intended at all. I don't know whether that might be the case with Sinterklaas as well.
Do you have, because we have about 5 more minutes, you came in late.
I
Is there
apologize
any,
for that.
that's okay, but if you have any specific question, maybe.
Yes, but I think maybe this has been already an issue. Did you discuss on the ANC, the democratic level of the ANC at the moment?
No, we haven't had a question.
So maybe I am able to raise that question. What is your opinion about democracy in South Africa at the moment, in the way that it's almost it's a one-state party now, one-party state, and can you speak of real democracy in your country at the moment? My name, by the way, is Leonard Ornstein, and I'm from a television program called Buiten, political and debating program.
Well, let me say, on paper, we have a wonderful democracy. Our constitution guarantees democracy, and it created all the necessary institutions for an ideal democracy. In practice, our democracy is not healthy. Yes, we have democracy. We have elections every 5 years. We have municipal elections regular. We have provincial elections. We have elections for the central government. They are fought openly under the auspices of an independent electoral commission. We've had handover of power from one president to another without any problems. All our elections have been declared fair and well managed. So yes, we have democracy. Why do I say it's not healthy? No democracy is healthy if one party holds 65% of the vote, as the ANC does at present, and all the other parties hold the rest of the 35%. But democracy is about changing such situations. As long as you have successful, well-organized elections, as long as you have freedom of speech, we have all that. It is possible to reduce the support for a dominant party and for other parties to grow their support. And I expect that next year's election will show some shifts in political support. In 2014 we have an election. New parties have been formed, some of them will just disappear, but 1 or 2 of them might make some impact on the 65% which the ANC holds at the moment. There is also disillusionment about deterioration in the quality of services amongst many people in South Africa, and there are even protests because of this. And the people protesting, the overwhelming majority of them last time voted for the ANC. So we might see a stay-away vote or a protest vote. So I expect some changes. But the ANC's perception of democracy is a faceted one. There are very good Democrats in the ANC. But there are those also elements in the ANC who feels the ANC's internal democracy is enough democracy for South Africa. They don't like the new constitution, and they at times try to undermine or erode our constitution. Last comment on the party political scene. I believe that the ANC will split. I can't predict when. I can't say whether it will be with a big bang or whether it will be a number of things taking place, split-offs or whatever. The cement which brought, you must remember the ANC is an alliance consisting of the ANC, which was established I think in 1912, of COSATU, the biggest trade union confederation, which is far left socialist in its thinking, and of the SA Communist Party, which believes still in communism, however outdated it might be. The cement which brought them and the nationalistic elements in the ANC who fought for their rights in the country of their birth, that was the basis on which the ANC was formed. The cement which brought them together with the trade union and with the SA Communist Party was the common goal: apartheid must end. Apartheid has ended. The cement is gone. And now you have in the same party far left socialists, true red communists, true believers in free market, conflicting visions and philosophies accommodated under one roof. It cannot hold. I don't know when it will happen, but it will happen.
And secondly, about the miners in South Africa, how is it possible that in a democratic state the miners were in such a horrible situation that they were all fired when they went on strike? That was a very...
South Africa has labor legislation which really favors the workers. It's very much favorable to workers, and the rights of trade unions are strongly protected in the labor legislation. What happened in Marikana is that the registered trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers, were beginning to lose support. And the new, at that stage, unrecognized in terms of labor legislation, trade union called AMCU started a strike which in terms of the labor legislation was an illegal strike. So it was more about conflict between two trade unions than it was really about conflict between employers and employees.
First, we're approaching the end, so if you could make it very short.
I forgot to say my name the last time. My name is Felix Lam. I'm from the Dutch United Nations Student Association. And you spoke about China's policies in Africa. We all know that China invests a lot, and that's, in my personal opinion, also really good for Africa. But China sometimes forgets human rights and the rights of its of the people working for the, let's say, the Chinese policy in the agricultural sector, etc. What's your comment on that?
Well, it doesn't seem to put European countries off to make investments in China.
You're right there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Well,
I
yes,
wanted to ask, the EU has been very affected by the economic crisis. Do you think that has changed the EU's role in the international?
Do
you think it has changed EU's role in the world?
Well, yes, in the sense that Europe's economy is not so dynamic, therefore it has affected countries which export to Europe negatively. It has affected countries which rely on new European investments negatively. So if your main trading partner or one of your main trading partners have a problem, it has a negative effect on the country itself. So yes, it had a negative effect on South Africa, it had a negative effect on some other African countries.
But in a political
And we would like to see growth, positive growth, returning to the countries of Europe and to the collective European Union. We would like European countries to become as successful as they were before, because that makes them better trading partners.
Do you view the EU differently?
Do
you view the EU differently? Do you see?
No, it didn't reduce.
The crisis?
It didn't change my views about the European Union. Fact is, the same thing happened in America, and I don't think the fact that there's a European Union can be blamed for what happened in 2008. It's the individual and collective regulation of banks and investment practices which contributed to, which really started the domino effect which we saw.
There are people waiting for Mr. de Klerk.
Dank je very much. Everything was best.
Thank you.
Alles van die beste toegewezen.
Ja, dat zit nu wel.